He had just 200 days to change a country that had taken centuries to break, and on the morning he was finally ready to speed everything up. Bullets shattered his windshield and stopped the clock forever. Picture Lagos, 13th of February, 1976. Humid air, early traffic, horns leaning on impatience. A black Mercedes glides into the chaotic flow near Falomo Bridge. Inside, the head of state of Nigeria, General Murtala Mohammed, leans slightly forward, as if his whole body is permanently tilted into the future. No siren, no armored convoy, just a man in uniform who believes he doesn't have time for ceremony. Then, an orange Datsun blocks the road. A burst of gunfire tears through metal and glass. Soldiers in camouflage step out of the car and fire again and again. In seconds, the man who wanted to drag a giant, chaotic nation into a new era slumps lifeless in his seat. His aide beside him collapses. The driver's covered in blood and shattered glass. Mercedes doors hang open like broken wings, in full view of office workers, traders, schoolchildren. If you freeze that scene and roll the story backwards, you get a life that feels less like a biography and more like a fuse. Short, bright, unpredictable, burning faster with every year. To understand why so many Nigerians still speak his name with a mix of awe, anger, and something like grief, you have to go back to where the fuse was lit, a dusty courtyard in Kano, 1938, British Nigeria. A vast colony sliced up on a map in offices thousands of miles away. In the old city of Kano, life is older than the empire that claims to rule it. Narrow streets snake between mud brick houses. The air smells of spices, sweat, and wood smoke. In one of those compounds in the Karawa quarters, on 8th of November 1938, a baby boy takes his first breath. His parents name him Murtala. The world that little boy opens his eyes to is full of contradictions. Outside, Union Jack flags fly over government buildings, but in the heart of the city, the emir's palace and the mosque still command, more awe than the distant governor general. His family's Muslim, disciplined and proud, with roots in the northern elite, but not rich in the way Europeans count riches. Their wealth is reputation, honor, and the ability to walk through Kano's markets with their heads held high. From the beginning, people notice something about Murtala. He isn't the quiet child who watches from the corner. He is the boy who pushes to the front of the group, who argues, who refuses to be ignored. When other children hesitate before speaking to elders, he blurts out questions that adults find rude, then charming, then worrying. He doesn't merely want answers, he wants to know why those answers should be obeyed. At school, that energy hardens into something sharper. Colonial education in northern Nigeria is designed to produce clerks and functionaries, not rebels. But in the classrooms of Kano and later Government College Zaria, a slim boy with alert eyes sits ramrod straight, absorbing lessons in English, mathematics, geography, and unintentionally power. He learns that somewhere far away, people who have never seen Kano decide how Kano is run. He reads about wars and empires and understands a brutal logic early. The people with uniforms and guns write the rules. Competition becomes his favorite language. In the dusty playing fields, he chases footballs as if they were the last chance on earth. In class, he is not satisfied with passing. He has to prove he can outrun, outthink, outtalk the boy next to him. Every test score, every game is a battlefield in miniature. He loses sometimes, angrily, noisily, but he never forgets who beat him and why. In one corner of the school, there is a small notice board. On it, once in a while, appear neat, typed notices about scholarships, training courses, opportunities. One afternoon, as the sun bleeds orange through the windows, a new notice goes up. The Nigerian army is looking for young men to be trained as officers. It promises structure, adventure, prestige. It promises a role in shaping the future of a country that is slowly, painfully negotiating its way out of colonial hands. The word officer lodges in his mind like a bullet. Officer, a person who gives orders, not just follows them. A person whose signature can move soldiers, convoys, entire towns. It sounds like the answer to questions he has been asking his whole life without knowing it. There is resistance at home. The army, to many parents, still sounds like danger and war and white men's battles. His elders imagine safer paths, civil service, teaching, perhaps even joining the expanding world of business. But Murtala is stubborn in the way only very young, very certain people can be. He argues, negotiates, refuses to let the idea die. He is not asking for permission. He is wearing his decision like a new uniform and daring the world to try and strip it off him. By the late 1950s, as the winds of independence blow across Africa, he joins the Nigerian army. Overnight, the boy from Kano becomes a small cog in a big, grinding machine. At training depots and barracks, he learns to march, to strip and assemble a rifle blindfolded, to read maps, to obey orders instantly. But he also learns about hierarchy. Who eats first, who speaks first, who gets saluted. His competitive instinct finds a new arena. Soon he's sent abroad for further training. In Britain, at places like the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, he enters a world that is both the center of empire and completely oblivious to the lives it has shaped. The weather's cold, the accents clipped. The young Nigerians in their neat uniforms are a curiosity, future leaders of a country whose independence is suddenly inevitable, according to politicians who just a decade ago swore it was impossible. In the lecture halls and on the drill squares, instructors talk of tactics, discipline, chain of command. But what sinks into him more deeply is something else. The quiet confidence of people who know their institutions will survive them. Britain has had centuries to build its military, its civil service, its traditions of handovers and retirements. Nigeria has none of that. It is a patchwork of peoples, languages, resentments, held together by borders drawn with rulers on European maps. Time. The word starts to haunt him. These men in red and gold have had hundreds of years to practice ruling themselves. Nigeria will have to learn in a few decades, or fracture. If a new class of Nigerian officers doesn't step up, the vacuum will be filled by chaos, or by men even less prepared. Somewhere inside, he starts counting silently. How long do we have before everything explodes? In the mess halls, he meets other young officers from home and from across Africa. Ambitious, hungry, impatient. Among them, one face will matter more than the rest. Yakubu Gowon, gentle in manner, careful in speech, a man who radiates a very different kind of authority. Where Murtala is sharp edges and quick decisions, Gowon is soft voice and patience. They train, joke, study together. At first, they are simply colleagues, two young men far from home. But rivalry has a way of germinating quietly. During exercises, instructors praise Gowon's calm under pressure, his ability to see the bigger picture. They praise Murtala's drive, his aggression, his refusal to be cowed by any scenario. On paper, they are complementary. In reality, every compliment given to one deepens something unspoken in the other. The army loves competition, it feeds on it. And the future of Nigeria is slowly being molded around this collision of styles. Independence comes in 1960 with flag-waving ceremonies and speeches about unity and progress. When the green and white flag rises and the Union Jack comes down, millions cheer. But for young officers like Murtala, the cheers sound hollow if they are not backed by real control. Civilian politicians take over from colonial administrators. But many of the structures remain the same. Fragile, improvised, vulnerable to pressure. Regional rivalries harden as political parties fall along ethnic and religious lines. Electoral promises become threats. Soon, the Nigerian army is no longer just training for hypothetical wars. It is sent to the Congo under the United Nations banner, to a country tearing itself apart after its own rushed independence. For the first time, Murtala sees what happens when a young state implodes. Burned villages, refugees with everything they own on their backs, corpses half buried in shallow graves by the roadside. Under the bright equatorial sun, he watches children with empty eyes cling to mothers who have no milk left. He marches past towns where the only remaining authority is the man with the largest gun. Congo is a mirror held up to Nigeria's possible future, and it terrifies him. In that chaos, his instincts come into focus. He leads small units into dangerous areas with a mix of boldness and calculation that startles even older officers. He gambles on rapid moves, forced marches, sudden attacks to hold back militias that seem to materialize out of nowhere. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it fails, and men under his command die. Each loss burns into him as evidence. Hesitation kills. In a country on the edge, the luxury of endless deliberation doesn't exist. Back home, Nigeria's shiny new constitutional democracy is already fraying. Corruption scandals bubble to the surface. Regional leaders act as if their parts of the country are private kingdoms. The promise of one Nigeria begins to sound like a slogan, not a plan. The military, watching from the barracks, starts to whisper. A few officers begin to imagine themselves as surgeons who might be forced to save the patient by cutting out the diseased parts. By the mid-1960s, the whispers turn into plots. In January 1966, a group of mostly Igbo junior officers stages Nigeria's first coup. Political leaders in the north and west are killed. The prime minister is assassinated. The country is shocked awake. In the confusion that follows, Major General Johnson Agiyi Ironsi, an Igbo officer, emerges as head of state. Inside the barracks, resentment boils. Many northern officers see the coup as ethnically biased, a deliberate attempt to sideline their region. Among them is Murtala. He is not one of the January plotters, but he watches the aftermath with cold fury. The new regime talks about unity, but promotions and appointments tell a different story. Once again, he feels time slipping away, only now it is not the abstract time of nation-building, but the very real time before Nigeria descends into open conflict. In July 1966, the counter-coup erupts. It is messy, bloody, fueled by vengeance. Officers are dragged from their homes and killed. Iransi is abducted and murdered. In the shadows, in offices and barracks, men like Murtala coordinate movements of troops, seize radio stations, block roads. Years later, many details will remain disputed. But one thing is clear. He is no longer just a promising officer. He is part of the group that physically seizes the state. Out of the chaos of the counter-coup, a new figure is pushed to the front. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon. The same calm, careful man from training now becomes head of state. Young, unassuming, presented as a compromise everyone can live with. He did not openly lead the coup, but he benefits from it. And somewhere deep in Murtala, the rivalry crystallizes into something harder. Gowon talks of no victor, no vanquished. He calls for reconciliation, gradual reform, slow healing. To many, this sounds wise. To a man who has marched through the ruins of Congo and seen what delay can do, it sounds dangerously naive. When the eastern region, under Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu, declares independence as the Republic of Biafra in 1967, Nigeria plunges into civil war. Gowon, now officially commander-in-chief, must hold the country together. But on the battlefield, much of the actual fighting is conducted by men like Murtala. He is put in charge of the 2nd Division, tasked with a brutal, simple mission: push Biafran forces back, reclaim territory, reassert federal control. The ordinary map of Nigeria, the one printed in school textbooks, does not prepare you for the reality of marching across it in wartime. Forests become hiding places for snipers. Rivers become choke points where bodies sometimes float past like terrible messages. Town names that once meant nothing to people in faraway regions become symbols of horror. It is here that his reputation hardens into legend and controversy. His 2nd Division advances with ferocity, crossing the river Niger, taking towns, breaking resistance. But victory comes at a terrible cost. In places like Asaba, along the western bank of the Niger, the lines between combatants and civilians blur, then disappear. Crowds gather for what they think is a peace address, only to face gunfire. The details, the precise chain of command, will be debated for decades. Witnesses remember mass graves, women wailing over open pits, the smell of blood and dust merging in the afternoon heat. For Murtala, these months are a crucible. He believes the war must be won quickly, decisively, to keep Nigeria from splintering into permanent hostility. He pushes his men hard, sometimes too hard. Orders are given in the heat of battle that he may later regret, or that others will forever lay at his feet. The clock in his mind is ticking louder now. Every day of conflict deepens hatred. Every delay makes unity more fragile. By the time the war ends in 1970 with Biafra's surrender, he is both celebrated and feared. In the north, many see him as a hero who defended the country and their honor. In the east, his name is spoken with bitterness, if at all. For the first time, he fully understands the weight of his own choices. He has kept Nigeria together, but at a price that cannot be measured in medals. After the war, Gowon keeps his grip on power. He promises a quick return to civilian rule, but the deadline moves like a mirage on the horizon. 1970 becomes 1974, then 1976. Government offices swell with new appointees. Stories of corruption, waste, and arrogance flow out of ministries like sewage. Oil money pours into the country, and much of it disappears into pockets and foreign accounts. Murtala is brought into the federal government as Commissioner for Communications, a powerful post in a country where controlling information and infrastructure means controlling movement, trade, influence. Sitting behind a ministerial desk in Lagos, he finds that the battles of bureaucracy can be as infuriating as any combat operation. Files vanish, decisions drag on. Simple reforms get stuck in webs of vested interest. In cabinet meetings, he watches Gowon chair discussions with his usual calm, his endless patience. To some, this is reassuring. To Murtala, it looks like fatal indecisiveness. He leans forward, speaks bluntly, pushes for action. He alarms colleagues with the speed of his judgments, his willingness to offend. He is not interested in being liked. He is interested in beating that clock he has been hearing since he was a boy. The countdown to the moment when Nigeria's luck runs out. Outside, ordinary Nigerians feel it too. The hope of independence has curdled into frustration. Students protest, workers grumble. Even in the barracks, grumbling grows loud. Junior officers complain that the revolution they thought they were making in 1966 has been hijacked by big men who are now comfortable in power. The rivalry between the calm head of state and his impatient commissioner is no longer just personal. It has become a symbol of two competing futures. One future drifts, adjusts slowly, hopes problems will solve themselves. The other future wants to seize the country by the collar and shake it awake, whatever the cost. Some nights, long after most of Lagos has fallen asleep, the lights are still on in certain offices and barracks rooms, around polished tables and on plain wooden benches, in whispers and low voices. A question is asked over and over again. Can Nigeria afford to wait any longer? Or will time finally run out? For Murtala Mohammed, the answer is becoming clearer with each passing day. The boy from Kano, the officer forged in Congo and in the fires of civil war, the minister enraged by the decay of government, he is reaching a point of no return. And somewhere, silently, that short, bright fuse of his life is burning faster. Imagine lying awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling, knowing that in a few days, you'll try to remove the most powerful man in your country, not as an enemy on a battlefield, but as a friend you once laughed with in a foreign mess hall. And if you fail, you won't just lose your career. You'll be marched into a courtyard, tied up, and shot at dawn. That's the edge Murtala Mohammed is standing on in the mid-1970s. Out in public, Nigeria looks calm. Oil money flowing, skyscrapers rising in Lagos, politicians and soldiers gliding past in black cars. But beneath the surface, the country is drifting, like a massive ship with a sleeping captain. For officers who fought through the Civil War, the drift feels more dangerous than gunfire. They've seen what happens when a state sleepwalks. They can smell it coming again. At the top of that drifting order sits General Yakubu Gowon, the old training ground rival's now head of state, the man whose signature decides life and death, war and peace. He is still the same. Calm voice, tolerant smile, endless patience. To the outside world, he is the steady hand that kept Nigeria from disintegrating during the Biafran War. To many inside the barracks, including Murtala, he is becoming something else, a leader who has forgotten how to move. The promise Gowon once made, to return Nigeria to civilian rule by 1976, hangs in the air like an echo in an empty room. Each time the date approaches, it is pushed back, softened, treated like a suggestion instead of a deadline. Ministries grow fat, contracts multiply. Stories spread of new mansions, secret accounts, officials who appear poor on paper but whose children drive imported cars. In smoky beer parlors and cramped student hostels, a bitter joke catches on. The government uses the treasury like a family inheritance. From his office as Commissioner for Communications, Murtala watches this slow-motion decay, like a man trapped behind glass during a house fire. Files disappear when they threaten someone powerful. Projects stall until something changes hands. Decisions that could be made in a day take months. His natural impatience, sharpened by war, turns into something darker, contempt. He begins to say aloud in small circles what others only mutter to themselves, that the revolution of 1966 has hardened into exactly what it claimed to destroy. The rivalry with Gowon stops being a private comparison and becomes a political fault line. In cabinet meetings, the contrast is almost theatrical. Gowon listens quietly, weighing each opinion. He thanks everyone, promises to look into issues, urges caution. Then Murtala speaks. Short sentences, hard consonants, no cushioning. He wants action. Sack this official, cancel that contract, discipline that commander. Some colleagues admire the clarity. Others exchange worried glances. They whisper that he is too rash, too angry, too willing to take a machete to problems that might be better pruned with scissors. Outside those air-conditioned rooms, a younger generation of officers is watching. Many of them grew up seeing Gowon as an almost fatherly figure. Now they see his government as an aging tree, broad, shady, but rotting inside. In the barracks, they swap stories of waste and arrogance. They remember the war slogans, the calls for sacrifice, and compare them with the new reality. Long convoys of senior officials, imported champagne, foreign trips. Their respect curdles into disgust. In this atmosphere, conversations start that are technically treason. No one calls them coup meetings. They begin as complaints over tea, then become strategy sessions over maps. Names come up again and again: Joseph Garba, Ibrahim Taiwo, Theophilus Danjuma, men who have tasted combat and bureaucracy and are sick of what they see. When they ask themselves who could possibly lead a decisive break with the past, one name cuts through like a blade: Murtala. But there's a twist. For all his loud impatience, he knows the cost of putting tanks on the streets. He has seen what happens when men with guns decide they alone can save a country. He has watched the January coup, the counter-coup, the war. He has seen mass graves in Asaba, refugee camps in the east, homes burned because some lieutenant misread an order. He doesn't step lightly toward another seizure of power. His arrogance is real, but so is his fear of plunging Nigeria back into chaos. Still, the clock in his head keeps ticking. Each postponed transition, each new scandal, accelerates the countdown. He thinks of Congo, of how fast a state can come apart once people stop believing in its leaders. He thinks of the North, where some feel cheated, of the East, where wounds from the war are still raw, of the West, where political tempers can ignite like dry harmattan grass. Nigeria, he decides, is a house full of fuel cans. Leaving it in the hands of a leader who keeps postponing decisions is not caution. It's suicide. The final push comes with a speech. In 1974, Gowon had hinted that the promise of a 1976 handover might not be realistic. By 1975, it becomes clear. There will be no return to civilian rule on schedule. The date that had been carved into so many minds melts away. To the young officers, it feels like betrayal. To Murtala, it feels like confirmation of his worst fears. The man he once sparred with at Sandhurst, the man he fought for during the war, is now, in his eyes, standing between Nigeria and its future. Plans tighten. Routes are studied. Key installations are mapped. The broadcasting house, the main barracks, the airport, the telephone exchanges that connect command centers. As Commissioner for Communications, Murtala knows exactly how fragile the network is that holds the country together, and how to seize it. The choice of date is calculated with cold precision. When Gowon will be out of the country, attending the Organization of African Unity Summit in Kampala. Taking down a government while its leader is abroad is not just tactical, it is symbolic. It says, you were looking outward while your house collapsed. The night before the coup, Lagos is almost too quiet. In some barracks, soldiers clean weapons with unusual care. In certain officers' quarters, uniforms are laid out with more attention than usual. A few wives and friends feel the weight in the air, but don't know its shape. Somewhere in the city, Murtala sits with a small group of conspirators, going over the plan one last time. The rivalry that began as two young men trying to impress British instructors has grown into a decision that will redraw Nigeria's history. Dawn, 29th of July, 1975. The city wakes up to the normal soundtrack. Vendors' calls, honking horns, radios clicking on, but at Doden Barracks, boots thud with a different rhythm. Armored vehicles move into position. Guards are relieved by men whose loyalty has already been tested in whispered conversations. At the broadcasting house, nervous technicians are pushed aside as soldiers take control of the equipment. Nigeria is seconds away from hearing that its leader has been removed, and he doesn't even know it yet. When the announcement comes, it is not with Murtala's voice. It is Colonel Joseph Garba who appears on the airwaves, calm but firm. He declares that the armed forces have decided to remove General Yakubu Gowon from office. He lists the reasons: corruption, delay, failure to keep promises of returning the country to civilian rule. For millions of Nigerians, the words feel both shocking and strangely expected. Like the sudden cracking of a dam everyone knew was under strain. In Kampala, Gowon hears the news in a foreign hotel room. A man once flanked by salutes and deference now listens like any other citizen, reduced to a spectator of his own fall. He is offered the chance to return and fight, to rally loyal troops. He refuses. Bloodshed, he believes, would tear the country apart. His calm, so infuriating to people like Murtala, manifests one last time as restraint. The rival steps aside without a battle. The game they have been playing for years ends not with a duel, but with one player quietly leaving the board. Back in Lagos, the question no one wants to ask out loud is suddenly urgent. Who will lead now? In theory, the coup might have produced a committee, a figurehead, months of internal jockeying. But within hours, one name settles at the top of the pile. The same qualities that made some officers fear Murtala now make them see him as necessary. Nigeria, they argue, doesn't need another slow caretaker. It needs a hammer. When he finally appears before the nation as the new head of state, the visual contrast with Gowon is stark. No elaborate regalia, no drifting sentences. He stands like a man in a hurry, voice clipped, eyes hard. He doesn't ease into his new role. He attacks it. He tells Nigerians that things will change, and soon, for a population worn down by years of drift, it sounds like electricity. For the civil service and the political class, it sounds like a warning shot. But there's another twist, one that only a few people close to him fully understand. Murtala doesn't see himself as a long-term ruler. Even as he takes power, he talks about leaving it. He speaks to his inner circle about setting a firm timetable, about making the military a bridge back to civilian rule rather than a permanent government. The man who just overthrew his old rival is already measuring his own time in office in months, not decades. That self-imposed time limit becomes an obsession. In war, he rushed operations because he believed delay cost lives. Now, he rushes governance because he believes delay will cost the country itself. He looks at the bloated civil service and sees dead weight that must be cut quickly. He looks at the chaotic sprawl of Lagos and sees a capital city choking on its own growth. He looks at the Constitution, the electoral system, the very way Nigeria is divided into states, and sees structures that must be reshaped before they lock in failure. Inside his new office, the clock is no longer metaphorical. Its ticking fills the silence between meetings. Every day brings files demanding decisions, reports of new scandals, petitions from citizens begging for justice. Every day also brings reminders that not everyone wanted him in that chair. Some officers nurse quiet resentment. Some old allies of Gowon consider him a traitor. The rivalry that propelled him to power has left behind a residue of grudges, unspoken and dangerous. He responds in the only way he knows, by moving faster. Committees are formed but given sharp deadlines. Reviews are ordered with clear instructions. No foot-dragging, no excuses. He pushes his team like a commander driving troops on a forced march, convinced that resting now will mean never reaching the objective. We don't have time, he keeps saying, to advisors, to commissioners, to himself. But we don't have time. Most of them assume he means time before the next election or before public patience runs out. None of them imagine that his real countdown is far shorter, measured not in years, but in the 200 days that history has secretly allotted him. The boy from Kano, who once raced classmates across dusty fields, is now racing a whole country against an invisible clock. The rival he has defeated is thousands of miles away, quietly beginning a new private life. The new rivals are less visible. Inertia, corruption, fear, and men in uniforms who wonder if this whirlwind of a leader is moving. Too fast, cutting too deep, changing too much. Somewhere in Lagos, as files pile up and decisions cascade, a different kind of plot begins to take shape. The fuse that brought him here is still burning, only now it is racing toward an end he cannot see. In the first 72 hours after the coup, more real power shifts in Nigeria than in the previous 9 years, and almost none of it is visible on television. No parades, no fireworks. Just a man in plain khaki, walking into offices with fluorescent lights that hum tiredly, picking up files that have gathered dust. For years, and saying a word Nigerian politics has almost forgotten: no. No to padded contracts, no to endless committees, no to promises without deadlines. For people who had grown used to a government that moved like a slow river, the change feels like being hit by a wave. One minute they're drifting, the next they're tumbling, gasping, trying to figure out which way is up. At the center of that wave, jaw tight, eyes burning, clock ticking, is Murtala Mohammed. He begins with shock therapy. Within days, a massive purge of the civil service is announced. Nigerians wake up to radio bulletins that sound less like bureaucratic memos and more like battlefield dispatches. Names are read out. Permanent secretaries, directors, senior officials, thousands of them, stripped of their positions in a single stroke. Some are guilty of embezzlement, some of laziness, some simply of being in the wrong office at the wrong time. Appeals are not encouraged. But we can't waste time, Murtala says. The country is bigger than any individual. Imagine the scene in those ministries. Men who spent 20 years in one office, who learned how to survive by never taking risks, now standing in corridors holding cardboard, boxes with their whole careers inside, framed certificates, rubber stamps, family photos curling at the edges. Some curse him, some weep. A few stunned simply stare at the notice on the wall as if reading their own obituary. To his critics, it is cruelty. To his supporters, it is the first honest house cleaning in Nigeria's history. He doesn't leave the purge to paperwork. He appears in offices unannounced, a head of state walking through dusty filing rooms, running a finger along shelves and coming away with a smear of neglect. He asks clerks why files are missing, why decisions take months. When answers wander, he cuts them off. "Oh, we don't have time," he snaps. That phrase becomes a refrain, echoing down the corridors like a marching order. But he knows that sacking people is not a policy, it's a warning shot. So he moves to something more ambitious, rewriting the timetable of Nigeria's future. In national broadcasts, his voice comes across as clipped, almost harsh, but the content is electrifying. He promises that military rule will end. A firm date, 1979. Not a vague in due course, but a specific horizon. Between now and then, he declares, Nigeria will draft a new constitution, reorganize its political structure, and return power to elected civilians. For a nation that has learned to treat political promises like theater, the detail is what stuns them. He announces a constitutional drafting committee. Names, numbers, deadlines. He doesn't speak like a man who plans to cling to power. He speaks like a contractor hired to repair a collapsing bridge under a brutal deadline. Build, test, hand over, leave. Yet even as he talks of giving power away, he is grabbing the old system by the throat. He orders that all major government contracts be reviewed. Many are canceled outright. Some untouchable businessmen suddenly discover that their influence has an expiry date. Import licenses that once flowed through backroom deals like contraband are frozen, examined, sometimes revoked. In a country where corruption had become a second language, the silence in certain drawing rooms is louder than any protest. Not everyone is impressed. Some senior officers, men who cheered when Gowon fell, start to whisper that things are going too far, too fast. It is one thing to remove a slow leader. It is another to unleash a storm that threatens everyone's comfort. Inside barracks and officers' messes, new comparisons begin. With Gowon, they say, you could talk to him, persuade him, slow him down. With Murtala, you barely finish your sentence before the decision is taken. And in the middle of those murmurs, a new rival begins to crystallize. Not the calm, distant figure of Gowon anymore, but a different type of opponent. The old order itself, embodied in those who feel personally attacked by the whirlwind reforms. Some of them wear uniforms, some wear suits. All of them start to watch the new head of state with a mixture of fear and calculation. Externally, though, the image looks heroic. On the international stage, Murtala becomes the loud, uncompromising voice of African pride. At a meeting of the Organization of African Unity, he attacks Western hesitations over Angola with words that ring like gunshots. Africa has come of age, he declares, insisting that African countries will decide their own destiny, not wait for the approval of Washington or London. For many Nigerians, hearing their leaders speak like that is a shock of recognition, a sense that the boldness they see at home is not just anger, but a deliberate stance. At the same time, he pushes a decision that will literally redraw Nigeria's map. Lagos, he argues, is choking. Too crowded, too chaotic, too vulnerable. The capital, he insists, must be moved inland, to a place that symbolically belongs to no single region. A panel is set up, led by Justice Akinola Aguda, to find and recommend a new site. When the reports come in, one name emerges from the savannah: Abuja. To many people, it is just a dot on a map. To Murtala, it is a way of breaking the old regional rivalries, north versus south, east versus west, by placing the political heart of the country in neutral soil. He doesn't stop there. Barely months into power, he announces the creation of new states, taking Nigeria from 12 to 19. It's not just administrative tinkering, it's an attempt to answer long-held cries from minority groups who felt trapped under larger neighbors. For some, the announcement feels like finally being seen. For others, it's terrifying. Old political calculations collapse overnight. Governors suddenly find their territories reduced. Local power brokers see their fiefdoms cut in half by a pen stroke. Every one of these decisions earns him fresh enemies. But Murtala behaves as if the only enemy that matters is time. He works late, wakes early, holds meetings that feel like military briefings rather than cabinet discussions. Files move across his desk and don't come back. Aides learn quickly. If you say you'll have something soon, he asks for a date and time. If you miss it, you're gone. Yet under the iron discipline, something else seeps through, an almost reckless simplicity. He refuses to turn himself into a distant monarch. He drives in a normal, unarmored black Mercedes with a small convoy. Sometimes he orders his driver to take regular roads, to get stuck in the same traffic as everyone else. How will I know what they go through if I fly over their heads? He asks. It sounds admirable. It is also an open invitation to anyone willing to risk a shot. Inside the officer corps, the rivalry that once existed between him and Gowon takes a new form. Now the comparison is made not between two men, but between two eras. Gowon the balancer, the compromiser, the man of long meetings and gentle persuasion. Murtala the hammer, the man of sudden decisions and ruthless deadlines. Young officers adore the change. Older ones, who built their careers on careful networking, feel hunted. Some of them remember that it was officers like Murtala who overthrew politicians in 1966, then Gowon in 1975. If this new wave continues, who will be safe next? Among those unsettled by the purge and the dizzying pace is a lieutenant colonel named Buka Suka Dimka. Brilliant to some, reckless to others, he had tasted influence under the old order and doesn't care for the new atmosphere of fear and speed. He watches as colleagues are retired without ceremony, as files vanish, as carefully nurtured connections crumble. To him, the man in Doden Barracks is not a savior, but a threat, a rival whose very existence means that men like Dimka may never rise as high as they once dreamed. The clash is not open. There are no shouting matches in public, no dramatic confrontations in corridors. It's colder than that. Dimka and others like him attend briefings, salute crisply, say, "Yes, sir," at the right moments. Then they retire to private rooms, pour drinks, and let their frustrations spill out as whispered questions. Is this still a revolution? Or has one ambitious man simply replaced another? Are they officers of a national project, or extras in the story of Murtala's ego? While those doubts ferment in the shadows, the public sees something else: speed. In markets and motor parks, people talk about sudden sackings, about governors being removed overnight, about decrees that actually change things. Mothers in crowded Lagos neighborhoods talk about hearing, for the first time, that the capital might move, that their children might one day live in a different kind of city. Students argue late into the night about the new constitution, about the promise of elections in 1979. But speed has a cost. The mass retirements leave holes in the civil service that can't be filled overnight. Some ministries slow down not because they are corrupt, but because they have simply lost too many experienced hands at once. A few of the innocent among those sacked sink into despair. There are stories, almost certainly true, of men collapsing of heart attacks when they hear their names on the radio, of families sliding into poverty in weeks. The line between justice and vengeance, between urgent reform and indiscriminate destruction, begins to blur. Murtala hears some of these complaints. They don't soften him much. "We cannot repair a rotten house with gentle taps," he tells his inner circle. "Sometimes you knock down walls." To him, each painful story is part of a necessary sacrifice, like casualties in a campaign. He carries their weight, but he keeps marching. The date 1979 glows in his mind like a target on a map. Everything slows if he hesitates. Everything fails if he stops. And still, the threats grow. Anonymous letters appear. Rumors circulate of officers meeting at odd hours, of plans sketched on napkins and burned in ashtrays. The security services alert him to possible plots. His response is infuriating to his protection teams. He nods, thanks them, and keeps the same light security detail. When urged to travel in a bigger convoy, in armored cars with darkened windows, he shrugs it off. "If God wants to take me," he says once, half joking, half not, "he will find me even inside a tank." That fatalism is part faith, part stubbornness, and part calculation. He knows that if he surrounds himself with too much metal and too many guns, he will become exactly what he despises: a leader separated from his own people by fear. His whole political persona is built on the opposite image: a head of state who can step out, walk among the crowd, feel the heat of their anger and their hope. To trade that for safety feels to him like surrender. The invisible clock keeps ticking. Day 100 in office, day 150. Each week brings a new bold move, a new enemy, a new layer of resentment in someone's heart. In quiet moments, few as they are, he thinks about Gowon, now living quietly abroad, the rival who refused to fight to keep power. Their careers have been like two lines crossing, one rising slowly, then flattening, the other spiking fast and high. Which of them will history judge more kindly? The cautious builder who stayed too long, or the reckless reformer who might not stay long enough? By early 1976, the temperature inside the system is near boiling. He has set Nigeria on a different course, but the shockwaves have not settled. Some officers talk in code, some avoid eye contact with him altogether. Dimka, meanwhile, is no longer just nursing wounded pride. He is listening to offers, trading in grievances, drifting towards something darker than mere complaint. The rival now is not a single man facing him across a table, but a shadowy cluster of men who see in his fall a shortcut back to their own lost importance. Murtala, characteristically, does not slow down to read every sign. He sees danger, but he has lived with danger since the days of mutiny and civil war. To him, the threat is another risk to be managed, not a reason to ease off the accelerator. He pushes for the state creation to be implemented, for the capital move to be formalized, for the constitutional process to stay on schedule. If anything, the whispers of plots make him more determined to tie his reforms so tightly into Nigeria's structure that even his death could not untangle them. And so the paradox tightens. The faster he moves to secure Nigeria's future, the more desperate his enemies become in trying to shorten his own. The more he tries to limit his time and power, the more others begin to imagine ending it for him altogether. Somewhere in Lagos, late at night, the sound of a ticking clock in his office is echoed by the quieter, more dangerous ticking in. The minds of men who have decided that this head of state cannot be allowed to see his 1979 deadline. On a warm February morning, the city wakes as it always does. Horns blaring, radios crackling, hawkers' voices mixing with the distant thrum of generators. In a modest house, the most powerful man in Nigeria buttons his uniform with the same quick, efficient movements he used in wartime. Outside, his black Mercedes waits, gleaming softly in the early light, its thin metal skin offering all the protection he insists he needs. His aides worry, his guards fidget. Somewhere not far away, other men are climbing into vehicles with very different intentions. The rivalries that have defined his life, schoolboy races at Kano, tense exercises at Sandhurst, cabinet arguments with Gowon, have quietly given birth to a final invisible contest between a head of state in a hurry to secure his reforms and those who believe the only way to stop him is to stop his heart. He steps out, walks toward the car, the clock in his head still ticking, the country's fate still tangled with his own. The door closes with a dull, ordinary thud. The engine starts. Lagos traffic opens just enough to let the Mercedes slide in among the buses and taxis, as if this is just another day. But somewhere up ahead, waiting in the flow of vehicles and exhaust fumes, is the moment when the countdown that has driven him for months will finally hit zero. When the bullets finally find him, they don't just tear through metal and flesh. They rip straight through a moving car and slam into something much larger, a timetable, a map, and a country that has exactly a few hours to decide whether Murtala Mohammed's revolution dies with his heartbeat or outlives him. The black Mercedes slows at a junction in Ikoyi. The morning light glints off its roof, off the windshields of buses and taxis around it, off the rifles lying low in the car just ahead. Lagos traffic closes in, careless and noisy, trapping the head of state in a cage made not of bars, but of bumpers and exhaust fumes. The ambush is quick, ugly, and brutally simple. A vehicle angles across his path. Soldiers jump out, uniforms creased, faces stiff with decision. For a fraction of a second, drivers nearby think it's just another checkpoint. Then the soldiers raise their guns. The first bursts turn the air to splinters. The Mercedes shudders under the hail of bullets, glass erupting outward in bright, lethal dust. Inside, the most powerful man in Nigeria is slammed back against leather that suddenly feels like stone. His driver, his aide-de-camp, the men who had rehearsed routes and timings, all of them are trapped inside a storm of metal designed for one purpose. It takes seconds, less than the time it takes a radio announcer to clear his throat, less than the time it takes a traffic light to change from red to green. One moment, the clock in his head is still ticking toward 1979. The next, it stops. Around the intersection, life stumbles, then breaks into panic. A bus conductor drops his change. A market woman screams, the tray of oranges on her head scattering across the road like rolling suns. Some people run, some drop flat onto the dusty pavement. A few just stare, frozen at the smoking car in the center of it all, unable to accept that something so huge could happen in a place so ordinary. The assassins don't wait to watch him die. They have their own clock to race. In a conspiracy, minutes are as deadly as bullets. While blood is still soaking into the car seat, engines start elsewhere in Lagos. A small group of officers move toward the radio station, toward the airwaves, toward the one weapon that can still decide whether this is just a murder or a new regime. At Radio Nigeria, staff are shoved aside by men who once drank with them, joked with them, sent in song requests. Now those same men point guns at them and bark orders. The studio smells of dust, stale smoke, and cold sweat. Papers are swept off desks. A microphone is dragged closer. Tapes are pushed aside. The red on-air light flickers on. A voice crackles out across the country, carried on radio sets in offices and kitchens and smoky bars. The words are stiff, triumphant, laced with grievance. The Supreme Military Council has been overthrown, the voice says. There was too much purge, too much fear. The head of state is no more. For a heartbeat, Nigeria hangs weightless. In barracks and ministries, men look at each other. Some feel their stomachs drop in shock. Others feel an old, secret hope flare up. Maybe the storm is over. Maybe the man in a hurry, the one who retired thousands with a stroke of a pen, who shoved the country onto a new path without asking politely, is finally gone. Maybe things will return to normal, whatever that means. But elsewhere in Lagos, in Doden Barracks, another kind of reaction is taking shape. Officers who had stood beside Murtala in meetings, who had watched him pace and slam his hand on tables and demand deadlines, now find themselves in a brutal, sudden exam. No preparation, no second sitting. Only one question, asked in the sharpest terms. Now that he's gone, whose side are you on? Olusegun Obasanjo, the man who has stood at his right hand, feels the weight of that question like a physical thing. Under Murtala, he was the quieter presence, the one who took notes while the head of state barked orders, the one who translated angry vision into workable steps. Now, with one burst of gunfire at a junction, he is pushed onto a stage he never wanted this way. There is no time to mourn, no time to argue, no time to search for perfect words. The coup plotters have the microphone, but they do not yet have the whole army. For a few hours, Nigeria exists in a terrifying gray zone. Two versions of the future battling over a narrow strip of time. On one side, Lieutenant Colonel Buka Suka Dimka, and those who see the last 6 months as a nightmare to be rolled back. They have the broadcast. They have the element of shock. They have the memory of colleagues dumped out of office by Murtala's purge, men eager to see his program buried with him. On the other side, officers who, for all their doubts and bruised egos, know that if this coup succeeds, every timetable Murtala set, 1979, the new constitution, the new states, the new capital, will be shredded before his blood has even dried. The choice is not between perfection and imperfection. It is between a harsh, rushed attempt at change and a return to something far worse. Phones ring, jeeps roar to life. Orders are shouted in clipped, urgent tones. Obasanjo and Shehu Musa Yaradua work the telephones and corridors, like men trying to seal off a leaking hull, plugging gaps in loyalty, before the whole ship takes water. Who is with us? Who is against us? Who is uncertain and must be turned fast? Within hours, pressure begins to shift. Some units declare for the government. Others stay neutral, waiting to see which way the wind blows. Dimka's broadcast, meant to sound like the voice of a new order, begins to sound instead like the voice of a man outnumbered, clinging to a microphone as the walls close in. By the end of that same day, the coup that murdered the head of state has failed to capture his government. Its leaders melt into the city's shadows, carrying their fear with them like a bad smell. Roadblocks go up, names are circulated. The hunt begins. Only then, really, does the country allow itself to absorb what happened at that junction. In homes across Nigeria, radios switch from the shaky language of the coup announcement to the heavy, mournful tones of official confirmation. Head of State General Murtala Mohammed has been assassinated. The phrase is clinical, almost cold, but the reality behind it hits like a slap. In Kano, where a boy once ran barefoot across dry playgrounds, people gather in groups, speaking in low, disbelieving voices. In Lagos, the streets hum with a strange mix of anger and fear. In the markets, women shake their heads and say, "He did too much, too fast." But he did something. In the universities, students pound tables, some shouting that a hero has fallen, others arguing that no one with that much power can be a saint. His body, wrapped and guarded, becomes the still center of a storm. Men who argued with him in cabinet now stand at attention beside his coffin, their faces arranged into lines of stone while their minds race ahead. Because even here, in the echoing halls where his death is officially mourned, politics has already moved to the next scene. Who takes over? What changes? What survives of what he began? The rivalry that shaped his last months, between his velocity and the old order's desire for comfort, does not end with the sound of gunfire. It simply shifts ground, changing from a clash between living men into a wrestling match between memory and convenience. Obasanjo steps forward, not with Murtala's explosive energy, but with a quieter, measured determination. When he addresses the nation, his voice lacks the sharp, staccato cadence Nigerians had grown used to, but the words that matter are there. The reforms will continue, he promises. The timetable towards civilian rule remains. It is a twist almost no one would have scripted. The man in a hurry is dead, but the man standing in his place chooses not to throw away the stopwatch. In private, Obasanjo could have argued that the purge went too far, that the speed was dangerous. Publicly, he chooses to tie his own fate to the path Murtala laid out. If the 1979 deadline is met, the story can still be told as a straight line, not a broken one. The country begins to organize its grief. A state funeral is planned with military precision. Flags droop at half-mast. Foreign delegations arrive, led by men who only months earlier were still trying to figure out this new Nigerian leader who spoke so bluntly about African independence and Western meddling. Now they walk slowly behind his coffin, calculating what his absence means for their own interests, even as they bow their heads for the cameras. In the streets, the mourning is less polished, more raw. People tape his portrait to walls. Taxi drivers place his picture on their dashboards. At newspaper stands, front pages fill with a stern face and a peaked cap. The lines around his mouth caught halfway between a frown and a challenge. The dates beneath his name shock everyone with their brevity. 37 years old, just over 200 days in power. There's a cruel arithmetic to it. 8 months to try to remake a country that had been drifting for almost a decade. A fraction of a lifetime to redraw maps, to fire thousands, to announce a brand new capital, to shout, "Africa has come of age," in a world that still preferred African leaders who spoke softly. In barracks cells, Dimka and his fellow conspirators wait for the other clock, the countdown to trial and execution. The man who tried to cut short another's timetable now faces one of his own. When he stands before the cameras, flanked by armed guards, the swagger is gone. He speaks of grievances, of injustice, of being pushed aside by Murtala's whirlwind. But by then, outside those walls, his words no longer compete with the dead man's image. The verdicts are swift. The firing squads assemble. And in a stark, unsettling symmetry, the rivals who believed a few bullets at a junction could reset Nigeria's trajectory are themselves, erased by the same state they tried to seize. Their names become cautionary footnotes in the story of a leader who never lived to see whether he had truly won. Yet the rivalry doesn't end with their deaths either. It simply moves again, changing into something more subtle. In office after office, in committee after committee, a quieter battle plays out. Between those who want to honor Murtala's program, in spirit, and those who prefer to honor it in slogans while weakening it in practice. On paper, the 1979 deadline stands. Committees meet to draft a new constitution. Arguments rage about presidential versus parliamentary systems, about checks and balances, about how to prevent another era of drift. In the middle of these technical debates, his name hovers like a haunting refrain. Would Murtala have accepted this? Some ask. Would he have tolerated this delay? The irony is sharp. The man who despised endless talk has become the absent participant in countless meetings. His ghost, if such a thing exists, sits at the table whenever timelines slip, whenever someone suggests, "We need more time." He's no longer here to slam his fist and snap, "We don't have time." But his remembered voice makes some people do it for him. Other decisions move forward more slowly, but still move. The idea of Abuja, once just a dot in a report he embraced, survives. Surveyors pick their way through dry grass and scrubland. Engineers unroll plans on tables. It will take decades to turn this patch of central Nigeria into a capital. But the seed is there, and everyone knows whose hand pushed it into the ground. The states he created do not vanish with him either. Their boundaries redraw loyalties, reshape politics, alter how Nigerians think about where they belong. Politicians who one day will never have met him still build careers inside units of the federation he willed into existence in a flurry of decrees. As the years pass, the picture of him grows both sharper and more complicated. Some of those purged in his lightning cleanup never recover. Their children remember him not as a hero, but as the man whose decision turned their father from a respected officer or civil servant into someone selling possessions to pay school fees. In their homes, the word Murtala tastes of bitterness. Others, especially the young who watched him with shining eyes in the mid-1970s, keep a different memory alive. The first leader in a long time who seemed visibly angry on their behalf, who looked like he might actually finish something before changing his mind. In student unions, in political gatherings, his name becomes shorthand not for perfection, but for urgency. We need a Murtala spirit, people say, meaning less talk, more action. When Obasanjo finally steps down in 1979 and hands power to an elected civilian president, the ceremony has a ghostly extra guest. The handover, carried live on radio and television, is the fulfillment of a promise that the man who made it did not live to witness. It is both an honor to his memory and a test of it. The fact that the date was kept is cited again and again as proof that his death did not derail his core aim. But legacy is never a simple thing. In later years, as Nigeria cycles through coups and brief democratic experiments and more coups, each new era reaches back toward his story and pulls out a different thread. Some officers model themselves on his toughness, his refusal to be cowed by foreign pressure, his crackdown on corruption. Others warn against his haste, citing the collateral damage of the purge as a lesson that even righteous anger can wound the innocent. Physical markers of his memory appear. An international airport bears his name, so that every departure and arrival in Lagos passes, at least symbolically, under his shadow. Streets and schools are named after him. Portraits hang in official buildings, showing a man whose time in office was so short that most artists must use the same few photographs as reference. And yet the real legacy is not in the frames on walls or the signs on terminals. It is in the uncomfortable, restless question his life and death still pose. How fast can you force a country to change before the system fights back? And what happens when the system decides to fight with bullets instead of arguments? His rivalry with opponents like Dimka ended in the most brutal, final way possible. But the deeper rivalry, the one between urgency and caution, between tearing down a rotten house and worrying about the people inside, never really ends. It plays out in every government that comes after him, in every debate about reform, in every leader who promises to move quickly, while glancing at the memory of a black Mercedes riddled with holes at a Lagos junction. For those who loved him, Murtala Mohammed remains the man who tried to do in months what others could not do in years. A flawed, fierce, and restless patriot whose time ran out in a traffic jam. For those who suffered under his decisions, he is a warning about the dangers of leaders who believe the nation's survival justifies almost any haste. For Nigeria itself, he is something harder to categorize, a turning point compressed into a human life. His rule was short, his end sudden, his methods controversial, his ambitions vast. But even decades later, when Nigerians argue about where their country is going and how fast it should get there, his name still slips into the conversation like a challenge from the past. As long as there are leaders tempted to drift and citizens tempted to accept drift as their fate, there will be someone, somewhere, invoking the man who refused to slow down until, in less than a minute of gunfire on a February morning, his countdown hit zero and his story passed from the realm of daily news into the sharper, more demanding territory of history and legacy.